Stay down. That's where you belong.
The sound of a 60-year-old woman's body hitting marble echoes through Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. Designer dress torn. Dignity shattered. Blood on her lip. Her own son standing over her, fists still clenched. "Stay down," he hisses loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's where you belong." The entire restaurant is frozen in horror. His millionaire friends stare in disbelief. This isn't some stranger. This is his mother. But here's what nobody in that room knows. This woman isn't just any victim. She built his empire. She owns his company. She controls his fortune. And she's about to use every ounce of her power to destroy him so completely that within 18 months, he'll be homeless, friendless, and begging her for forgiveness. Stop scrolling right now. I need you to ask yourself one question. What could a 60-year-old nurse possibly do that would terrify a millionaire CEO? By the end of this story, you'll never underestimate a mother's love. Or a mother's wrath. Hit subscribe because what happens next will blow your mind. What led to this moment? Why would a successful businessman destroy his own mother in public? And more importantly, what was she about to do to him that would make his attack look like a gentle pat compared to her revenge? David Mitchell was Chicago's golden boy. At 35, he commanded respect in every boardroom on LaSalle Street. CEO of Mitchell Digital Solutions, a tech company that revolutionized online marketing for Fortune 500 companies. His penthouse in the Gold Coast gleamed with success, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a Tesla Model S in the garage below. But there was a secret behind David's empire that no one knew. Margaret Mitchell, his 60-year-old mother, had built it all. Every dollar, every opportunity, every foundation stone of his success came from a woman who worked double shifts as a registered nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital to fund her son's dreams. When David was 12, his father died in a construction accident. Margaret became everything: mother, father, provider, cheerleader. She worked overtime to keep their small house on North Cleveland Avenue. She took out a second mortgage to pay for his business school at Northwestern University. She emptied her retirement account to give him startup capital in 2012. In her trusting love, she even signed legal documents making her a 40% partner in his company, though David told her it was just paperwork for the business loan. Margaret never asked for credit, never demanded recognition. She stood in the shadows of his success, smiling proudly while he accepted all the accolades. To the Chicago business community, David Mitchell was a self-made man. The truth was, he was a mother-made man who'd forgotten where he came from. The warning signs had been there for years. Family dinners where he'd roll his eyes at her stories. Christmas parties where he'd introduce her as just my mom with barely concealed embarrassment. Business events where he'd change the subject when she tried to share her own professional accomplishments at the hospital. "You wouldn't understand, Mom. It's complicated," became his standard response to anything involving his world of money and power. Margaret felt it, the slow erosion of respect, the way he looked at her like a burden instead of the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. But she loved him. And love, she believed, could weather any storm. She was about to discover how wrong she was. March 15, 2023. The signature room on the 95th floor, overlooking the glittering lights of Chicago. David had just closed the biggest deal in his company's history, a $50 million contract with Boeing. He'd invited his college friends to celebrate. Marcus Coleman from the hedge fund world, Jennifer Walsh from Kirkland & Ellis law firm, Stephen Park, who'd built half of River North, and Lisa Rodriguez from Leo Burnett Advertising. Margaret hadn't wanted to come. She felt out of place among David's wealthy friends, uncomfortable in the designer dress he'd bought her with a warning, "Please don't embarrass me, Mom." But it was rare for David to include her in his world, and she cherished any opportunity to spend time with her son. The dinner started perfectly. David held court, regaling everyone with stories of his negotiation tactics, his voice carrying over the soft jazz and clinking crystal. Margaret sat quietly beside him, proud despite feeling invisible. To his friends, she was just David's sweet mom. They had no idea she'd once managed the entire pediatric wing at Northwestern Memorial, or that she'd helped design patient care protocols that saved countless lives. The turning point came when Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Patricia Williams, head of nursing. "Margaret, the board approved your patient care system for the entire hospital network. We want you as head consultant. This could revolutionize healthcare in Chicago." For the first time all evening, Margaret felt genuinely important. Her face lit up as she read the message. "Good news?" Jennifer asked, noticing Margaret's smile. "Oh, it's wonderful," Margaret beamed. "The hospital wants to implement my new patient rotation system hospital-wide. They're offering me a consultant position to oversee." "Work?" David interrupted, his voice sharp with alcohol and irritation. "Mom, you're 60 years old. Shouldn't you be thinking about retirement instead of playing nurse?" The table grew uncomfortable. Margaret tried to explain. "David, it's important work. Patient care has always been my passion." "Important?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What's important is that you're making a fool of yourself. And me." His friends shifted uneasily. Marcus tried to intervene. "David, maybe we should—" "No." David stood abruptly, wine sloshing from his glass. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of having to explain why my 60-year-old mother is still trying to be relevant." Margaret felt the world tilt. Around the table, his friends looked away, mortified. "You want to know the truth?" David turned to his friends, gesturing at Margaret like she was an exhibit. "She's a burden. A relic. She doesn't understand business, doesn't understand success, and frankly..." His eyes were cold, empty. "I'm tired of carrying dead weight." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. "David, please," she whispered. "Please what?" His voice was venomous now. "Please keep pretending you matter? Please keep acting like your little hospital games are important." He leaned over her, his face twisted with contempt. "When are you going to accept that nobody cares about your pathetic attempts to stay relevant?" Margaret stood on shaking legs. "I care, David. I care because I'm your mother. I care because I love." That's when he snapped. David shoved her backward, sending her stumbling into the chair behind her. Gasps filled the restaurant. Conversations stopped at nearby tables. Margaret tried to catch herself, one hand reaching for balance, the other instinctively protecting her chest. But David wasn't finished. As she struggled to steady herself, as his friends watched in frozen horror, as the entire restaurant held its breath, David Mitchell raised his foot and kicked his own mother. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Margaret crumpled to the marble floor, her designer dress torn, her dignity shattered along with something deeper, the illusion that her son was still the boy she'd raised. "Stay down," David hissed, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "That's where you belong." The silence was deafening. Then chaos. Jennifer kneeling beside Margaret, Stephen calling 911, Lisa sobbing, Marcus staring at David like he'd never seen him before. Sirens wailed in the distance as paramedics rushed through the restaurant doors. But as they lifted Margaret's trembling body onto a stretcher, something in her eyes had changed. The woman who'd raised David with endless patience and unconditional love was gone. In her place was someone far more dangerous. Margaret woke in Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the same place where she'd dedicated 30 years of her life to healing others. The irony wasn't lost on her as familiar faces, doctors and nurses who'd been her colleagues, looked at her with pity and rage. Dr. Patricia Williams sat beside her bed. "Margaret, honey, the police want to know if you're pressing charges." Margaret stared at the ceiling, her body aching but her heart broken beyond repair. She thought of the little boy who used to bring her dandelions from Lincoln Park, the teenager who'd cried in her arms when his father died, the young man who'd promised he'd always take care of her. "He's my son," she whispered. But as hours passed in that sterile room, something else began growing inside Margaret Mitchell. Not just grief, though the grief was overwhelming. Not just hurt, though she felt shattered in ways she'd never imagined. Anger. Cold, focused, intelligent anger. Margaret had spent 3 decades managing one of Chicago's busiest hospital departments. She'd handled impossible schedules, difficult doctors, life and death decisions, bureaucratic nightmares that would have broken lesser people. She'd balanced million-dollar budgets, managed hundreds of staff members, implemented systems that saved lives across the entire hospital network. David thought she was just a simple nurse who didn't understand the real world. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong he was. The revelation came when Dr. Williams brought Margaret's personal effects from her work locker. Inside was a folder she'd nearly forgotten about, legal documents from 2012 when David had started his company. Papers she'd signed when she mortgaged her house to give him startup capital. In his arrogance and haste to get her money, David had made her a legal partner in Mitchell Digital Solutions, not just an investor. She owned 40% of the company that had made him rich and arrogant. The same company he'd built on her sacrifice was, legally, partly hers. For the first time since the restaurant, Margaret smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who just found the keys to her son's kingdom. Margaret didn't want just any lawyer. She wanted Sarah Chen, known throughout Chicago's legal community as the Destroyer. Sarah's office in the Loop was legendary, walls lined with newspaper clippings of powerful men she'd demolished. CEOs exposed, politicians ruined, titans of industry reduced to nothing. When Margaret walked into that office, still moving carefully from her injuries, Sarah saw something in her eyes that made her lean forward with interest. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sarah said after hearing the story, "most people want divorce lawyers or personal injury attorneys. You want something else entirely." Margaret's voice was steady now, no longer the broken woman from the hospital. "I want him to understand what it feels like to lose everything. I want him to know what betrayal tastes like when it comes from the person you trust most." Sarah studied her new client. Revenge cases are expensive, dangerous, messy. They consume everything. Are you absolutely sure you want to go down this road? Margaret looked at the wall of clippings, powerful men brought low by their own arrogance. "Miss Chen, my son thinks I'm a helpless old woman who doesn't understand how the world really works." Her smile was ice-cold. "Let's show him how wrong he is." The plan they crafted together was surgical in its precision. Phase 1. Psychological warfare. Feed his paranoia and arrogance until he destroyed his own reputation. Phase 2. Financial annihilation. Use her legal ownership to systematically dismantle his empire. Phase 3. Social obliteration. Ensure every person in Chicago's business community knew exactly who David Mitchell really was. But Margaret insisted on something that surprised even Sarah Chen. Phase 4 would be forgiveness. "When it's over," Margaret said quietly, "when he's lost everything and understands what he's done, I'm still his mother. And mothers forgive." Sarah stared at her client, unsure whether she was witnessing the greatest strength or the most dangerous delusion she'd ever encountered. It started with anonymous messages that appeared on David's phone just days after the restaurant incident. While he tried to convince himself everything would blow over, his world began tilting off its axis. What you did to that woman was unforgivable. She deserved better than a son like you. Your mother is under our protection now. Stay away. David deleted them, assuming they came from witnesses at the restaurant. But they kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. He hired a private investigator to trace the numbers, but they led nowhere. He installed extra security in his building, convinced enemies were closing in. What he didn't know was that every message came from Margaret herself, sent through untraceable apps from her hospital bed. Each text was carefully crafted to feed his paranoia, to make him believe the entire city was turning against him. Then came the flowers. Funeral arrangements delivered to his office, lilies and roses arranged like memorial services. The cards read, "Sorry for the loss of the son you used to be," and "In memory of David's humanity." His secretary brought them to his attention with increasing confusion. Margaret had chosen those specific flowers because she knew they'd remind him of his father's funeral, the last time she'd seen him cry with genuine emotion. His friends began distancing themselves. Marcus canceled their weekly golf games. Jennifer stopped returning calls. Stephen and Lisa avoided him at networking events. None of them explained why, but David could see it in their eyes: disgust, disappointment, the look of people who'd witnessed something unforgivable. The isolation was exactly what Margaret had predicted. She understood her son better than he understood himself. Without his social circle, without the admiration of his peers, David began unraveling. The Chicago Business Association annual gala at the Palmer House became David's public execution. He arrived alone, trying to project confidence, but something felt different. Conversations stopped when he approached. Former allies found excuses to walk away. Then she appeared, a stunning woman in a red dress, walking straight toward him across the crowded ballroom. "David," she called out, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Darling, I haven't seen you since that weekend in Dubai." David's face drained of color. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Oh, don't be modest." She threw her arms around him, speaking just loud enough for everyone nearby to overhear. "I know things at home aren't going well. Your mother's in the hospital, isn't she? After what you did to her." The woman pulled away with theatrical concern, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I just hope you're getting help for those anger issues." She vanished into the crowd, leaving David standing alone while every eye in the room burned into him. What he didn't know was that the actress had been hired by Sarah Chun for $2,000 and a single night's performance. The rumors spread like wildfire through Chicago's interconnected business community. David Mitchell beats his elderly mother. David Mitchell is having affairs. David Mitchell is mentally unstable. David Mitchell cannot be trusted. By morning, the Chicago Tribune business section ran a devastating profile. From success to scandal, the rise and fall of Mitchell Digital So. The article included quotes from former employees detailing David's toxic leadership, financial experts questioning his business practices, and a heart-wrenching sidebar about Margaret Mitchell, the nurse who'd sacrificed everything for a son who repaid her with violence. Investors began pulling out of deals. Business contacts blocked his calls. The Boeing contract was under review. David's carefully constructed world was collapsing in plain sight, and he had no idea his own mother was the architect of his destruction. The boardroom meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. David walked into the conference room at Mitchell Digital Solutions expecting routine damage control. Instead, he found Margaret sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Sarah Chen and 3 outside investors. "Mom." His voice cracked with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Margaret looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no trace of the woman who'd once kissed his scraped knees and made him chicken soup when he was sick. "I'm here as a founding partner and primary investor in this company," she said calmly. "I'm here to call a vote of no confidence in the current CEO." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing David's misuse of company funds for personal expenses, the penthouse down payment, the Tesla, expensive dinners that were personal entertainment rather than business meetings. Client testimonials revealing his dishonest practices. Employee statements detailing his abusive management style. And the security footage from the restaurant, crystal clear evidence of him attacking his own mother. But the nuclear weapon was the legal documentation proving Margaret's 40% ownership of the company. In his arrogance, David had never bothered to read what he'd made her sign 11 years earlier. One by one, the board members reviewed the documents. Their faces grew grim as the scope of David's failures became clear. This wasn't just about violence against his mother, though that alone would have been grounds for removal. This was about a pattern of behavior that threatened the company's existence. The vote was unanimous. David Mitchell was out. Security escorted him from the building while his former employees watched from the windows. His access cards were deactivated. His company credit cards were canceled. The penthouse, leased through corporate funds, was no longer his. By evening, David Mitchell, who had woken up that morning as a successful CEO, was homeless, unemployed, and completely alone. 6 months after losing everything, David Mitchell was unrecognizable. The confident executive had been replaced by a broken man living in a studio apartment in Uptown, working part-time at a Best Buy in Schaumburg. He drove an hour each way in a used Honda Civic, selling electronics to customers who sometimes recognized him from the news coverage. "Hey, aren't you that guy who beat up his mom?" they'd ask. "Cash or credit?" He'd respond quietly. The loneliness was crushing. His college friends had completely cut him off. Business associates treated him like a pariah. Dating was impossible. Every woman who Googled his name found articles about what he'd done. The worst part was the silence from Margaret. She never called, never texted, never acknowledged his existence. It was as though he'd ceased to exist for her, just as he'd made her feel invisible for years. The breaking point came on a rainy March evening, exactly 1 year after the restaurant incident. David was walking home from work when he saw her coming out of Northwestern Memorial, probably finishing a consulting shift. She looked healthier than she had in years, confident, successful. For a moment, their eyes met across Michigan Avenue. David felt his heart stop, hoping for some flicker of recognition, some trace of the love that had once existed between them. Margaret looked right through him, as though he were a stranger, and walked away. That night, David Mitchell finally understood the full scope of what he'd lost. The message came on his phone 3 weeks later, the first direct communication in over a year. Warehouse District, 2247 West Fulton Street. Tonight, 8 p.m. Come alone. David drove through Chicago's industrial area near the United Center, past places where his mother had once taken him to Bulls games when they couldn't afford good seats. Everything in his life led back to her. The warehouse was vast and empty. Margaret stood in the center, small but commanding. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, but there was a strength about her that David had never recognized when he was too busy dismissing her. "Mom," he whispered, his voice echoing in the emptiness. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she began walking in a slow circle around him, her footsteps measured and deliberate. "Do you know what you destroyed that night?" she asked finally. David tried to speak, but she continued. "You destroyed 35 years of unconditional love. You destroyed every sacrifice I made, every dream I had for the man you could become. But most importantly, David, you destroyed yourself." Then she told him everything. How she'd orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. The anonymous texts that had driven him to paranoia. the mysterious flowers that had haunted his days, the actress who'd publicly humiliated him, the evidence she'd gathered to destroy his company, the social campaign that had made him untouchable. "Every sleepless night you've had," she said, circling him slowly, "every moment of fear, every loss you've suffered, I planned it all." David fell to his knees, sobbing with the reality of his complete defeat. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know why I know why," Margaret interrupted. "You stopped seeing me as a person. You forgot I was the woman who sang you to sleep when you had nightmares. You forgot I was the one who believed in you when no one else did." She stood over him now, her shadow falling across his crumpled form. "You thought I was weak because I loved you unconditionally. You thought I was stupid because I didn't understand your world of money and power. But David, you were wrong about everything." Margaret knelt down beside her broken son, and for the first time since the warehouse conversation began, her voice softened. "David, look at me." He raised his tear-stained face, expecting to see hatred, satisfaction, or triumph. Instead, he saw something that broke him completely, the same love that had been there throughout his childhood, tempered now by wisdom and pain, but unmistakably present. "I forgive you." The words hit David like a physical blow. He'd prepared for anger, for final condemnation, for her to walk away forever. But forgiveness? It was the last thing he'd expected and the only thing that could truly destroy his defenses. "Mom, no," he sobbed. "You can't forgive this. I don't deserve." "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve," Margaret said gently, reaching out to touch his face the way she had when he was small. "It's about who I choose to be. It's about the love that's still there, despite everything you did to kill it." She helped him sit up, her hands gentle despite the strength they'd shown in tearing apart his life. "For months, I planned your destruction. I wanted you to suffer the way you'd made me suffer. I wanted you to feel abandoned the way I felt abandoned. And when I succeeded, when I saw you broken and alone, I realized something important." Margaret walked to a small table and picked up a photograph, the two of them at his college graduation, both beaming with pride and hope for the future. "Revenge didn't heal the hole in my heart. It didn't bring back the son I'd lost to arrogance and cruelty. It just made the hole deeper." She turned back to him, her eyes clear and certain. "I have a choice. I can hold on to pain and anger forever, let it poison whatever years I have left. Or I can choose to remember that underneath the cruel man who hurt me is still the little boy who used to tell me he loved me more than all the stars in the sky." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "I choose love, David. Not because you've earned it, but because that's who I am. That's who your father raised me to be. That's who I want to be until I die. I'm still your mother. You're still my son. What you did was unforgivable, and I forgive you anyway. That's what love is, not a feeling, but a choice. And I choose to love you." David collapsed completely then, overwhelmed by a grace he'd never expected and didn't deserve. "Forgiveness," Margaret explained, "didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. It didn't mean their relationship could return to what it had been before. Trust is rebuilt slowly," she told David as they sat together on the warehouse floor. "Respect is earned through actions, not words. Love is a choice I'm making, but relationship is something we'll have to build together, if you want it." David's response was immediate and desperate. "I want it. I want to be your son again. I want to be the man you raised me to be." "Then it starts now," Margaret said. "Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts. It starts with honesty, humility, and hard work." The rebuilding began that very night. David started seeing Dr. Michael Torres at Rush University Medical Center to understand the toxic attitudes that had led him to violence. He began attending support groups, facing the ugly reality of what he'd become. Margaret attended some sessions with him, not as his victim but as his mother, helping him understand the impact of his actions while providing the support he needed to change. David had to rebuild his life from nothing. Margaret didn't offer him money or connections. She'd learned the importance of letting him earn his own way. But she offered something more valuable, her presence. She helped him find an apartment in Logan Square, attended job interviews to show potential employers that someone believed in his capacity to change, and cooked dinner for him once a week, slowly rebuilding the connection they'd lost. Most importantly, she helped him understand what he'd really destroyed that night in the restaurant. "It wasn't just me you hurt," she told him during one of their dinners. "You destroyed the legacy of your father, who died believing he'd raised a man of character. You destroyed the dreams I'd carried of who you could become. You destroyed your own chance at authentic happiness." But she also helped him understand what could still be rebuilt. 2 years after the warehouse confrontation, David Mitchell was genuinely transformed. He worked as a counselor at the Chicago Coalition Against Domestic Violence, helping other men who'd committed acts of violence understand the impact of their choices. His apartment was modest but warm, photos of his parents on the mantle, books about emotional intelligence on the shelves. He drove the same used Honda, not because he couldn't afford better but because he'd learned to value substance over symbols. Every Tuesday, he had dinner with his mother. They talked about everything: his work with domestic violence survivors, her consulting projects at the hospital, the Cubs' chances, memories of his father. The relationship wasn't what it had been before, but there was something new, a depth of understanding they'd never had. David finally saw his mother not as an obligation or embarrassment, but as a remarkable woman who'd chosen to love him despite having every reason not to. Margaret saw her son not as the perfect child she'd once idealized, but as a flawed human being genuinely committed to change. David had reached out to his former friends, not to ask for forgiveness but to apologize. Some, like Jennifer, eventually agreed to meet with him. Others, like Marcus, made it clear they weren't interested in rebuilding any connection. He accepted both responses with grace. His work at the coalition became his passion. He facilitated support groups, spoke at high schools about toxic masculinity, wrote articles about family violence prevention. "The hardest thing to accept," he told one group, "is that I'm not a monster. Monsters are easier to understand. They're just evil. I was an ordinary man who made extraordinarily cruel choices. That's scarier, because it means any of us can become the villain in someone else's story if we stop paying attention to who we're becoming." 3 years after the restaurant incident, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone who knew their story. She agreed to appear with David on Chicago Tonight, the city's premier public affairs show, to discuss domestic violence, forgiveness, and redemption. The interview was watched by over 200,000 people across Chicagoland. Host Paris Schutz didn't pull punches, playing security footage from the restaurant and asking hard questions about whether forgiveness enabled future abuse. Margaret's response became the most quoted moment. "Forgiveness isn't about pretending the harm didn't happen. It's about refusing to let that harm define the rest of your life. My son committed an unforgivable act, and I chose to forgive him anyway. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from the hatred that was poisoning my own heart." David's part was equally powerful. "I destroyed the most important relationship in my life because I thought strength meant never showing weakness. I learned that real strength is admitting when you're wrong, doing the work to change, and accepting that some damage can't be completely undone. My mother forgave me, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning that forgiveness." The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories of family violence, forgiveness, and redemption. Other families found hope in their story: sons and daughters who damaged relationships with parents, parents who'd given up on children who seemed beyond redemption. 5 years after that terrible night at the signature room, Margaret Mitchell celebrated her 65th birthday at a small restaurant in Lincoln Square. David gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes. 5 years ago, I was a successful man who'd lost his soul. I had money, respect, and power, but I'd thrown away the only thing that really mattered, the love of the woman who'd given me life twice. Once when she brought me into this world, and again when she chose to forgive me for trying to destroy both of us. He looked at his mother with genuine gratitude. Mom, you taught me that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. You taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Margaret's response was simple but profound. My son learned something that took me 60 years to understand. The most powerful thing we can do isn't to destroy our enemies. It's to love them until they stop being enemies and become family again. The evening ended with something unthinkable 5 years earlier, mother and son dancing to Frank Sinatra's The Way You Look Tonight, the same song that had played at Margaret's wedding 38 years before. As they danced, Margaret whispered in David's ear, I'm proud of who you've become. And for the first time in 5 years, David felt like he might actually deserve to be her son again. Today, David Mitchell is 40 years old. He never remarried, dedicating himself to his work and his relationship with his mother. He's become one of Chicago's most respected advocates for domestic violence prevention. Margaret Mitchell is 68 and serves on healthcare boards across the city. Her book about forgiveness, The Strength to Choose Love, has helped thousands navigate their own journeys through betrayal and healing. Their relationship isn't perfect. There are still moments when the past intrudes. But they've learned that love isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. The questions their story raises are complex. Was Margaret's forgiveness profound strength or dangerous enabling? Can someone who commits an unforgivable act truly be redeemed? Is revenge ever justified, even when it leads to ultimate forgiveness? These questions don't have easy answers, but Margaret and David's story suggests that the most powerful transformations happen not when we destroy our enemies, but when we love them back to life. Margaret Mitchell learned that revenge might satisfy the desire for justice, but only forgiveness can heal the wound. Her strength wasn't in her ability to destroy David's life, it was in her choice to rebuild it alongside him. David Mitchell learned that true power isn't about dominance, it's about service. The transformation from destroyer to healer required facing the darkest parts of himself he'd spent years denying. Their story reminds us that families can survive even the most devastating betrayals, not through pretending damage didn't happen, but through the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding trust one choice at a time. Most importantly, their journey proves that forgiveness isn't weakness disguised as strength. It's strength so pure it can transform enemies into family, hatred into love, and despair into hope. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and forgiveness? What would you have done in Margaret's situation? When someone has hurt you deeply, what helped you heal? Margaret and David Mitchell's story challenges us to consider how we balance justice with mercy, when forgiveness becomes possible without forgetting harm, and what it looks like to love someone while still holding them accountable. The truth is, their story isn't over. Every day, they wake up and choose again, choose to work on their relationship, choose honesty about struggles, choose to believe in each other's capacity for growth. What makes their story so powerful isn't that it's unique, it's that it's universal. We all have the capacity for both cruelty and love. We all face moments where we can choose to build up or tear down, to forgive or hold grudges, to see humanity in people who've hurt us or write them off as irredeemable. Margaret Mitchell chose something harder and more beautiful. She chose to believe that love is always more powerful than hate, that redemption is always possible, and that the strongest people aren't those who destroy others, They're those who love others back to life. That choice, to love instead of hate, to heal instead of harm, to forgive instead of destroy, is available to all of us. The question is, what will you choose? If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear that redemption is possible, forgiveness is powerful, and love can survive even the most devastating betrayals. Subscribe for more stories that challenge us to be better than our worst moments. Remember, you are not defined by the worst thing you've ever done or the worst thing that's been done to you. You are defined by what you choose to do next. Choose love. Choose forgiveness. Choose hope.